Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for checking us out, coming and dedicating some of your time this morning for a very, very awesome topic shared to you by my buddy Neil and Chanda Gibson from 308 Collective. We are Mission Control. I am part of it, as long as some of my fellow members here, and give you a little bit about Mission Control. It was founded in 2018, and it's a nonprofit think tank comprised of professionals dedicated to the success of the nonprofit community and their missions. The members consult and provide valuable services to help nonprofits operate more effectively and efficiently. We host masterclass, breakfast briefs like this one's, and other events to stimulate and engage executives who are dedicated to positive impact. To learn more about us and our events, as well as the members, you can check out our site at missioncontrolny.com. So for today, you guys are in for a treat. Neil and Chen, as I mentioned, I'm going to go over a great topic. So over the last few years, the resilience of the nonprofit workplaces have been tested like never before. Many nonprofit organizations are faced with a growing number of workers emboldened to advocate for organizational changes that go far beyond routine calls for more diverse and equitable cultures. Employees are leading the charge for change and accountability now more than ever, and it's critical that organizations know how to listen and respond with reasonable care. This morning, we will enjoy an engaging discussion on impactful workplace culture renovation, featuring Neil Fleischman, former board chair of Queens Botanical Garden, and Chanda Gibson, founder and CEO of 308 Collective, a consulting firm dedicated to renovating the workplace cultures, one relationship at a time. So with that said, let my good buddy and fellow Mission Control member, Neil Fleischman, take it away.
Thanks, Bobby. Appreciate that. And welcome, everybody. Thank you again for taking time to be with us this morning. I think we have a great program that you'll find very engaging. My name is Neil Fleischman. I'm one of the founding members of Mission Control. I'm also the area president for Payday, which provides payroll and employee benefit solutions to nonprofits all across the country. I've also always been sort of engaged in the nonprofit space, giving my time, serving on boards, volunteering. So the space has always been near and dear to my heart, hence why we started Mission Control, just for that reason. We are fortunate this morning to be joined by Chanda Gibson from 308 Collective. And Chanda, why don't you introduce yourself and we'll get the program going.
Hi, thank you, Neil. Good morning, everyone. My name is Chanda, and I am delighted to be here. I come to this work having led a nonprofit, sat on boards of nonprofits, now consulting a number of nonprofits in the space of workplace culture, diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And so there's not a better kind of sector for me to really think about these issues, given that I've kind of seen it from all sides. And so I'm delighted to be here today and hopefully share some of my experiences and then learn from you all as well. So thank you, Neil.
Yeah, great. So why don't we jump in? So most organizations, nonprofits included, have certainly become familiar with the narrative surrounding DEI, right? It's always out there. It's in the news. It's one of those acronyms that's been bantered about quite often. But workplace culture really seems to be a different animal. So two-part question. How would you define workplace culture? And as a follow-up, how and why do you distinguish the work you do from more traditional approaches to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I want to answer that question. But what I would love to do is kind of get everyone's thoughts. So you can either via chat, you can come up very quickly. But maybe just think of one word, one adjective when you think of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, whether it's at your organization in general. I'm just really curious to get a sense of what word comes to mind for you all. Just feel free to popcorn in, and I'd love to just start there. Anyone feel free to just jump in. Anyone? Anything? Vulnerability, gathering collective perspectives, shared power. Good. These are good ones because it means that you have a good sense of what diversity, equity, inclusion work is supposed to be. Unfortunately, in my experience, and part of why I launched 308 is oftentimes it feels like things like vulnerability, things like how do you actually think about, is there a power differential that needs to be addressed? Are there structures that need to be addressed? Is this workplace a safe place for us to do our best work? Oftentimes, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I find, tends to sit much more in the headspace, which is not typically about vulnerability. It's about what is the data? Just tell us what we need to do. What do we need to know? And you have to do this or else, right? There'll be a consequence. And here we go. And so this idea of triggering, right? There's a lot of ways in which when we have these conversations, it can be triggering, both for sometimes historically the underrepresented groups within a company, but also for leadership. And so I think this idea of vulnerability and courage is really, really important. And so that's really at the base of what we do at 308 Collective, is we find ways to create safe spaces to have the conversations that we need to have. And the way that we do that is that we create these kind of bespoke sessions that really encourage reflection. So both individual reflection, but then also collective reflection around what is our responsibility to each other and what is the responsibility to the organization. And so 308, we define workplace culture as everything from leadership, behaviors, written, unwritten rules, right? It's all of the things that are kind of in the groundwater of an organization. And one of my colleagues, Sharon's, always says, kind of what's in the root is in the fruit. And so oftentimes what organizations think are diversity, equity, and inclusion pain points and blind spots are often because of what broadly sits within the organization's workplace culture. So that's how we define workplace culture. And our work is all about how do you create and curate these opportunities for self-reflection and engagement. And so we kind of have this idea of culture, unlocking culture. And so we use a text-based approach in our work. So we use a lot of literature, poetry, video, audio recordings, ways that people can find connection and commonality, but also really be able to feel comfortable and safe, being vulnerable, being courageous, and sharing ultimately to reach their own decisions, right, and their own conclusions, rather than being told that this is what you need to learn, this is what you need to do. Because I think in our experience, you have to have your heart vibrating on the same frequencies before you can even think about doing the head work of DEI. And so that's really the space where 308 plays.
Right.
Yeah.
Wonderful information. Thank you. So, because obviously our audience are nonprofit organizations, a lot of times nonprofits can be a little bit of a different animal than a typical for-profit organization. So what are some of the most significant dynamics influencing today's workplaces that you think nonprofits need to adapt to?
Yeah, so, I think, and we talked about a little bit in the overview for this conversation, but I think, the confluence of George Floyd's murder, the pandemic, just what's happening in society at large, one of the really important things to remember is, workplaces are not immune from the tensions and the pushes and the pulls of what's happening in broader society. And the responsibility that we have is to think about what is our role in managing and navigating those influences. And so I think one of the biggest things in the DEI space is this sense of employees for the first time almost being emboldened to talk about and share and kind of use their voices in ways they hadn't before, and almost demand change. And in some instances, it's done professionally. In some instances, it comes from a place of real emotion, because in many instances, there's a lot of real pain there. And so there's a responsibility that leadership has now, I think, in a way that they haven't, to really grapple with and tackle how do we manage this dynamic. And this kind of, we talked about power a little bit, in the sense that there is a demand maybe to think about how we use power, how are we using it responsibly, who has to give something up in order for others to give, and are they really prepared to do that? And so I think for me, that's one of the biggest things, is this kind of rise of humanity in the workplace, and really leaders thinking about how do we navigate this in the short term, which often can, result in an immediate crisis or, something that needs to be managed. But in the longer term, really just thinking about what does this mean for us as leaders of an organization, and as a nonprofit, thinking about the mission of the work that we do. Do we reflect the communities that we serve? Does our leadership, does our organization, does our staff feel good about the communities that they're working in? And do they feel connected? Do they have shared experiences? Do they feel safe being themselves in the workplace? These things are all really, really important, particularly, I think, for nonprofits that are doing direct service work in the community. The relationship with their own employees is incredibly important, but how you're touching and reaching the communities and how responsible you're being in those human interactions is something to be very mindful of as well. And so we spend a lot of times with our nonprofit clients thinking not only about their own internal workplace, but externally, how they're reaching their clients and the community, and who is doing that work, and how supported do those kind of folks on the direct line feel. And so I think it's really, really important, particularly in the nonprofit space, to really be thinking about internally from the inside out, right? From the very, kind of most entry-level employee all the way up and through the board. And then similarly, how that actual work connects and, permeates within the work that they do within the community. And oftentimes there's disconnects and just usual ways of doing business that now are, I think, being challenged in a way that is healthy. But I think generationally is not something that is just this short-term thing. I think we see that this is something that we all have to learn how to navigate. And I think in the nonprofit space, it's really, really important to be mindful of that because of how many young people really start their careers oftentimes in the nonprofit space.
No, it's a great point. It's true. There are so many young people, thankfully, that do start their careers in the nonprofit space. And it's really interesting how, I should say that way, I think nonprofits need to be more aware of all these polarizing things that go on in society, how that has an effect on them. And obviously they bring that to work as well. So no, those are really, really, really great points. So for me, I always find the easiest way to understand unfamiliar topics or hearing about real life experiences. So I was wondering or hoping you could share a few examples of some success stories and the challenges you experience with working directly with your clients.
Sure. So yeah, I'll start with a few challenges, share a few successes, and then Neil, I would love for you actually, I know in prepping for this conversation, you shared some of your experiences as board chair of the Botanical Garden. So I'd love for you, when I'm kind of done sharing, maybe you can offer some of your own experience there as well.
Sure.
It'd be helpful for folks. So yes, stories of challenges. So one of the hardest things about this work is it's really personal and it's a labor of love for all of us at 308 Collective. And so because we work so hard to really know our clients and be vulnerable with our clients and think really carefully around how we do this kind of delicate work, it can be really hard when you want to have a big impact. And sometimes you have to get comfortable with, even if you just reach one person and change something in one person's life, that is still an impact and that's still a positive outcome, because this really is about sustained, impactful change, and it's individual and it's collective. And so one client we had was a performing arts center. And, to their credit, they were in a predominantly white community, but they were really wanting to kind of, push the envelope in terms of the programming that they had. And so they would actually introduce productions that would have fairly diverse casts. And oftentimes they would be directed or it'd be by, a playwright of color. But they were really doing what they could to kind of bring culture to this, not very diverse community. But one of the things that, resulted from that was this realization after a few incidents happened that when cast members would come to be in these productions, it wasn't always a safe space for them to be. And so oftentimes there would be plays where there might be, you know, a typical cast member that was trying to play a role that historically had some uncomfortable aspects to it in terms of, you know, depicting racially something, for example, that made them feel uncomfortable. But because it was a largely all white, you know, kind of staff that was making the creative decisions, it was really, really hard for the artists to feel like they would be taking a risk, right, by challenging anything about the creative process, right? Or artists would come and it would be the first time that they were living in a rural place, and people would yell racial epithets at the door. Or we had an experience where a board member shared in one of our conversations that they actually walk on the other side of the street because of things that have been said to his child from this particular location. And so we were having this conversation, and we always try to like break down as many boundaries as we can. And so we had board members, we had visiting cast members, we had members of the staff, and we were all in conversation and really thinking about what does it mean to be diverse and be inclusive, but then what do you have to do to protect, right, that diversity? And so there was a big conversation around, well, you know, we should figure out a way to not warn people, but kind of prepare, right, and be responsible and prepare the diverse kind of members that are now going to be part of our community, for example, for the summer. But we also don't want to scare them off, right? Because we want them to come, and it's a phenomenal place, right? The work they're doing is really important. And then we also need to make sure that members of the community are welcoming. And so we spent a lot of time grappling with how do you do both of those things, right? Because oftentimes you're risking as a nonprofit, right? Your donors, members of your audience, you know, you want to do what's right and be diverse and be inclusive, but there are risks involved in that. And so ultimately, you know, one of the successes that came out of that was, well, you're not going to say, don't frequent this place, or don't go there, or, you know, don't do this. But what you can do is you can actually have some of your diverse cast members, you know, create a video that welcomes people to the community and talks about all their favorite places to go, things they really like to do, but introduce them to the community in a way that isn't necessarily setting them up, right, to be uncomfortable. And so sometimes it's really just finding those nuanced ways to accomplish the same thing in a way that everyone can get comfortable. We've also had experiences where, you know, one of the things about this work is that it very much often is repair work while you're rebuilding, right? Because there's a lot of times there's hurt and there's frustration, and there's kind of this need to give a voice to the voiceless, but also make sure that leadership can understand it in ways that are non-threatening. And so we always try to bring the experiences to life in any way we can. And so one of the kind of challenges, and this will be my last one, was we had realized that with this particular client that depending on where you were in the organization and who you knew, your experience could be very, very different. And it was really important for leadership to understand that we're kind of most removed from some of the experiences, what that felt like. And so we created this sense of, you know, when you walk on an airplane and there's a first class, maybe a business class, right? And then there's kind of the regular coach class, and the different levels of attention you get, right? The different amenities you get, and how far it can feel when you're sitting right in that last row of the airplane up against the bathroom to even be able to relate to what it feels like to be in first class. And so we thought that this was a great way to kind of bring this to life, but, you know, it actually made leadership a little bit defensive because they thought that we were being, you know, critical of the culture. But I think, you know, for us, it's always about even unlocking that and then being able to unpack it is a success, because it's a conversation that needed to be had. And so, you know, we always do this work with the hope of finding the right thing for that right organization that's going to unlock the conversations, but it's not always successful. But there are these just amazing times where people are like, oh my gosh, I get it. This is literally just about being a human and caring about one another, right? And listening and slowing down and taking the time. It's not about programs, right? It's not necessarily about the data. It's about, we're all humans. We have a responsibility of care to each other. Now, how do we work together to get there? So,
Yeah, no, I think those are fantastic examples. And I think, a couple of things you touched on there resonate with me a lot, because I find nonprofits, especially executive leadership and board as well, you're so wrapped up in your mission, right? What's our organization supposed to be doing? What are we trying to accomplish? What do we have to accomplish? That it's so easy to lose sight of all the things you're talking about. So just to share a little bit of my firsthand experience. So I was fortunate enough to serve a 6-year term on the board of the Queens Botanical Garden, which is in Flushing. There is one in Queens, everybody, not necessarily that big one in the Bronx or the other one in Brooklyn. There's a beautiful one in Queens. And, I served a lot of roles while I was on the board, including board chair. And so in my first year on the board, I'm thinking about, again, getting back to mission, everybody's focused mission. And one of our, basically, the mission tagline was a place where people, plants, and cultures are celebrated. So, being that upstart first year board member, thinking about that and totally understand how, physically we're doing that for our audience. But so I posed the question, are we doing the same thing internally for the culture of this organization and the staff and the folks that work there? Of course, that was met with a little bit of shock and awe. Nobody sort of brought that topic up in a boardroom before. And, it kind of quickly, people didn't want to continue that conversation. They felt it was uncomfortable, right? Thankfully, probably in less than a year or towards the end of that year. So Queens Botanical is, a New York City cultural institution. So we're on New York City property. We're get a big chunk of funding from the city of New York, and the Department of Cultural Affairs started a directive to all the cultural institutions in New York City that, they gave us, I believe it was a year to create, adopt, and implement a DEI plan, which was fantastic because it was like, thankfully, it's like a voice from above for me, like got involved and wanted to march down a path that, I was hoping we could go down as an organization. So, that process started, and it was a really smooth journey. The executive staff and the board, got on the same page, a lot of transparency, and it was put in place. But thankfully, we didn't stop there. And I think that's a trap that a lot of organizations can fall into, thinking, all right, our work is done. We did this DEI thing, right? People are pushing for it. Maybe like in this instance, our funding source is telling us we have to do it, right? So you have no choice. So you do it. And way too often it sort of stops there. But thankfully, this sort of opened up minds, especially in the boardroom, that, wow, you know what? This thing that Neil talked about, a year and a half ago about talking about cultural reorganization, now that is a logical next step. So the first thing we did was we created a DEI committee. Okay, so think about it, a committee comprised of, we let the employees choose who was going to be on this committee. And then on top of that, we asked them to pick one person to sort of be the chair of that committee. And we gave that person a seat at the boardroom. So they were in our board meetings, and now, we were letting that voice be heard, right? The employees or the staff had an opportunity now to really talk about, in a safe way, what's going on. What do they like about what's going on? What don't they like about what's going on? What's going on in the world that might be affecting the way they feel about the place that they're working at? This was a great first step to really just be willing to listen and to have those uncomfortable conversations, because that is a part of it. And thankfully, it was a welcomed process. and eventually a really good and healing process for the organization. I felt that, having a strong board was a really big part of that, of the culture change, taking the lead, pushing the agenda with the executive staff. That's where, that uncomfortable stuff starts. It's not just having uncomfortable conversations with employees, it's getting the leadership to get to a comfort level that they never thought they would have to deal with. So, I think working in an organization or being on a board of an organization that had term limits was really important in this process. So we had people that were coming on and off the board, new people, open to ideas, open to change. Term limits, just like in politics, a whole nother conversation. We could probably do a whole breakfast brief just on that. We're not going to get into that there. So my advice to any of you folks out there, even if you've started down the road with a DEI plan, or maybe even if you haven't, make sure a DEI committee is part of it. It's it's an amazing way to really start marching down that path. So the last thing I'll share for you, and it's something you touched on, Chanda, is so my last year that I was board chair was 2020, right? Pandemic. All hell breaks loose. We're trying to figure out how to keep the doors open, just like everybody else. But then a powder keg got lit from the George Floyd incident. So I go back to what you brought up, Chanda, about having a lot of young people in your organization, and also we had a very diverse staff, and it was a resentment. Okay, and unfortunately, the same time that happened, there was a company memo sent out, sort of like a weekly memo that went out to all the staff. And there was an unfortunate, choice of words used in that. We'll just leave it at that. And, it could have blown the roof off this organization, to be honest with you. And if we hadn't already been taking the steps that we had in the previous year to start addressing culture and giving people a voice and having everybody, meaning staff, executive staff and board together, it kept this organization together. That's how serious it could have been. And I was really proud of the role the board took, being active leaders in making sure that this process happened. So now that I've shared that, it might be a good segue to talk about the role of boards, right? And I'd love to hear from you, Chanda. Where do you see, because everything can't just happen and shouldn't just happen from an executive leadership standpoint. And sometimes it should be the board that maybe has to lead the charge in things like this. Just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just to build on a couple of things that you said, earlier in that example, which is fantastic, is this idea of just support, right? Because it's the staff that needs support, the leadership that needs support, and the board oftentimes. And in order to feel invested enough in something to want to support something, there has to be a level of trust, right, that exists and that's there, because it does take courage and it does take vulnerability and it does take self-reflection and saying, what, maybe actually I should find a diverse person in my organization to sit on this board when my term expires, right? And I'm committed to finding that person to support this work moving forward. My company can still stay involved, but I'm going to actually identify someone in my organization to bring forward, right? But in order to do that and to have that kind of reflection, there is this level of fundamental trust that's needed. And I think that role between the board and executive leadership in particular, that trust is really, really important, because you can not have enough trust, right? To where you don't actually let the person lead and trust them to do what's necessary within the organization in the day-to-day. And you can a board can micromanage, right? But also, I think sometimes a board can be a little bit too trusting of leadership and take more of a hands-off approach. And we know that we talk about this, that, and this in a board meeting, and there isn't really a space to question or to ask, right? Or to think about, well, how do we actually, how are people doing, and how do people think about our culture, and are they feeling connected, right? How well do we as the board actually know, right, anything about, the staff that are doing the day-to-day work? And so I think it's really, really important. I mean, we had an example with a nonprofit where there's this kind of uprising from, right, the diverse employees on staff, right? They were largely working in a brown and Black community, right? Largely white leadership, largely white board. And the staff, right, was really challenging, and they were threatening to unionize, and everyone was in a panic and didn't know what to do. And so after spending some time with members of the staff, members of the board, we realized that there were just all of these kind of disconnects. And the leadership was actually kind of, in some ways, responsible for kind of the gaps in where the communication was going, both from the board, down into the organization, and kind of vice versa. And so once we were able to build a relationship with the leadership of the organization, there was actually this kind of joint realization that it actually was the leader that needed to kind of change in some ways, right? The board was focused on, we need to focus on becoming more diverse so we have more voices represented and we can stay more connected to the work we do. The leader was like, you know what, I realize that I think after these 10 years, right, and founding this organization, that it's time for me to find, right, someone that is going to be able to think a bit differently about how we connect our work and how we kind of cultivate our employees. And then the staff, right, and what I thought was really good about your example was involving the staff in these conversations and to be part of this process, right? It has to feel like it's co-created. And, we always say at 308, like, as many people as possible in an organization should see themselves in the solutions that are in that plan, because it takes sustained investment and commitment, right, to be able to sustain and create impact over time. And so it's really, really important, I think, to not forget that the board has a responsibility for the culture of the organization, as well as the financials, right? As well as all of the other day-to-day things that need to be managed. But, by and large, they'll always otherwise have to react to the problems and not actually get to kind of think proactively about ways to make sure, to your point, that culture is really, really strong when there are those moments of kind of crisis and challenge, but also in thinking about how you actually attract people to want to be part of your organization, right? Board members are ambassadors for the organization. They're ambassadors for people that want to work at the organization. And so thinking about, as an ambassador, what responsibility does that board have to really have the pulse on what the culture of the organization is? I think it's really important.
Yeah, no, those are great points. I mean, in my work that I do outside the work I do 9 to 5, I find nonprofits, one of their big issues from a staffing point is employee retention. And everything we're talking about today, they all like, oh my God, what are we going to be able to do? Well, look within. Just by addressing the culture of your organization and understanding what your employees feel and want and need, and showing them that you care to address this with them, goes a long way to attaining that retention that they all want. I had another question for you. I think we probably already answered it 6 different ways, but I'm going to ask it anyway in case maybe there's something that we didn't touch on so far that might people might want to hear here. So, right, we've been in the pandemic. A lot of challenges coming out of the pandemic for all these organizations. A lot of them might still be struggling to keep their head above water. So why should a cultural renovation project like we're talking about be a priority? I mean, I think we've given tons of reasons why already, but is there anything that we didn't touch on that you think is worth mentioning here?
Yeah, I think, absolutely, Neil. And actually, Daryl asked a question in the chat that I think we can weave in here, which is, how can staff safely give feedback to the board about the executive director in those cases? And so I think, this is a really, important thing to think about in terms of where you position the DEI work within an organization, right? Oftentimes it sits within HR, which is the same place, right, that controls if there's kind of employee relations issues, right? It cannot necessarily feel like a safe place for people to go when they have concerns and they do have feedback around, for example, someone in leadership, and how does that get to the board? And I think that's where, you know, for us, we always think about our work is not only, you know, helping to facilitate these conversations, but also being there sometimes to be a bridge and to almost be that safe place that people can come when they have issues and they have concerns. And so a lot of times, you know, what we do is we host these, what we call kind of open office hours, where, you know, anyone that works with, you know, our particular client organization can actually reach out to us, spend time with us. And if they have concerns, we then can kind of get a commitment from them that we'll share those concerns, whether it's with the board or, you know, or otherwise, you know, who in the organization might be able to manage that. But I think it's really, really important for organizations to think about what is that safe space, because otherwise what's going to happen, and what always happens, right, are these informal kind of communities of support, you know, emerge. And then what happens is a lot of times, right, and I think affinity groups, sometimes we hear about these, right, kind of employee groups within organizations, but things kind of fester and things, right, there's games of telephone that happen where so-and-so said this and then this happened, and it can just be a very negative space rather than a very supportive space. And I think it's really, really important for organizations to think about what is the safe space for our employees to give their feedback, and how can they give that feedback without fear of consequence. So I think employee surveys, you know, are helpful, but I think thinking about who is that trusted human being that we know without consequence is there to help us navigate this is a really, really important thing to think about, and a really critical thing when you think about building the culture of an organization. Who are those culture carriers? Who can you engage? And how can you constructively connect them with the different levels of leadership in your organization so you can ensure that those concerns are addressed?
That's great. Sorry, I lost internet connection for probably about a minute in the middle of that. So I apologize. Dara, one of the things I wanted to throw in there too is, you know, if you create a DEI committee, and, you know, when I said we gave that committee chair a seat in the boardroom, I gave them a seat in the executive session. So when you talk about a safe place, I gave that person a seat when the executive staff left the boardroom. So now there was no fear. They were just talking to board members. And that was one of my intentions, was to really create that safe space, because if you don't have it, you're never going to get the honest, true interaction and understanding that that you're trying to get. So yeah, I found that to be a big key to it. So, and I encourage Daryl, thank you for throwing that in the chat. I encourage anybody and everybody throw questions in the chat, because we're going to address them in a short couple of minutes. I just had one more question for Chanda. And that would be, and I'm always a big believer in these things, you know, we really respect and appreciate that everybody came here to take some time this morning to listen and learn. And I always want to make sure there's a good key takeaway for everybody. So what would that be, Chanda? What would be, if you had to pick one item, or maybe it's a couple, that we'd want members to take away with them this morning? I know I think we've given them, you've certainly given them a lot of great thought and ideas that they can take away with them, but what do you think that would be?
So I think the first one is really like, don't fear change. Like, I think that change can be challenging, but it can be really healthy and really constructive. And I think, you know, particularly when it comes to culture, if your culture is not evolving, your organization will die, right? Like, if it's not evolving with the times, with the generations, right, with all of the things that an organization should be thinking about in terms of strategy, you can't be afraid of change. And so I think, you know, for us, it's about how can we, if we honestly are committed to doing this work and doing this work in the way that it needs to be done, you can't say that you want to be anti-racist without taking the steps to really understand what that means, and then understand what you're comfortable with, what you're not comfortable with. And I think in not being afraid to change, not being afraid to communicate as well, because I think oftentimes, right, it feels like DEI work gets done to you and not by you. And you get told what's going to happen, right? There's a message that comes out, right, that says that your organization believes X, Y, and Z, but you're like sitting there and you're like, but that's not how, it feels at all. And you don't want those disconnects to happen. And so I think, not being afraid to change, but also then not being afraid to communicate and to connect is really, really important and fundamental to all of this work. And really, really important and really, really hard, because we get focused on all of these other, kind of day-to-day tasks that we have to manage. But the culture is really the heart of the organization. And so it needs tending, and it needs that kind of, courage to change.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So since I lost my internet connection, I lost my chat too. So I don't know, Bobby, has anybody else thrown any other questions into the chat at this point?
Yes, I had a great question from Heidi. What are some good questions and drill downs to ask organizations that you are interviewing for services, where it's part of an RFP, to get to the realistic DEI environment and not just the messaging they're communicating about what they're doing? The board and senior management composition doesn't always tell the full story.
Okay.
It's a detailed question.
Yes. All right. Okay.
Read it again.
So if you're writing, it's a great question, Heidi. So you're writing an RFP. And so Heidi, let me ask you, so is your question, if you're looking for services to support your culture building work, how do you ensure that that particular consultant actually understands the environment and what needs to happen or change?
Yeah, I mean, more about, our clients are looking for providers to perform services for them. And in our not-for-profit market segment, it's very important for them to hire organizations that have, and not only have a DEI initiative, but also walk the walk internally. So when we go through these and we facilitate these RFPs for hiring service providers for our nonprofit clients, they are trying to chip away at what is your realistic DEI internally, not just who the pictures you're putting up on your website and your brochure that looks really glossy and pretty, but what is under the hood realistically in your organization.
Got it. So it's less about hiring someone DI, but just RFPs in general. So, I think one of the really, helpful things is that now there's a lot more data that's available. And so there's a lot more that you can ask for, right? And so, yes, how diverse is your board? But then really understanding, do they actually disaggregate their diversity data, for example, right? Is it just, can they tell you just women, versus men? Do they actually address inclusively, right? Kind of non-binary, for example, right? How are the ways that they actually track their data, and can you actually understand, and do they disaggregate it in a way that you can actually understand the full picture? Because, sadly, there are a lot of ways that you can kind of, hide the ball in data. And so I think really thinking about ways of asking for disaggregated data, but then I think also thinking about mechanisms that employees have to provide feedback. And a lot of times, is there an employee, engagement survey, right? And do employees, how do employees articulate what the culture of the organization are? I think those are all things that you can ask to get a sense of how thoughtful they are in those responses, right? Because oftentimes you'll just get a cut and paste of, what was in their annual report, their statement. But I think if you drill down and you actually ask some very specific questions about their culture, right? About feedback, and ask really disaggregated data and how they actually articulate, the work that they do, both internally and then through the services that they provide. A lot of times there's not that kind of click down to ask those more specific questions. And then that's where I think you can kind of, not that you want to catch people, but I think, you'll also start to see some differentiation in terms of the thoughtfulness of the responses you get. Is that helpful, Heidi?
Yeah, very helpful. Thank you.
Sure. And by the way, I would say, do you have a strategic plan, right? You can ask, are your leaders, is that tied, right, to their incentives, right? Your accomplishments within the DEI space. There's different ways that you can kind of really suss out whether or not, that commitment is showing up in practice.
So I have a question. One of my clients couldn't make it this morning, and I just saw an email they sent me, and they had a question that they were going to ask while they were here, and they asked if I could address it and get back to them on it. What she said was that her organization finds just the idea of this incredibly overwhelming situation with everything that's going on day to day, right? And I'm assuming that's a fairly common scenario, certainly for a lot of small to medium-sized nonprofits. So, what would you recommend as you got to start somewhere, right? What is that starting point that they should focus on, right? Not worry about getting over the mountain, but, where do they start?
Yeah, so I think they start by listening. Right. Listening is something that can be done fairly cheaply in terms of really trying to, again, kind of create those safe spaces to have a dialogue to really identify. And I think you can easily, right, and similar to what you did with the botanical gardens, you can actually create a group of like-minded folks that are interested and invested in this work, right? And so you can find them from around your organization, and then you can find that employer staff member, right, that's willing to kind of engage that group. And I think the really, important thing to think about is, what is that group being convened to do? And so, we always say that, there are big things you can do, but there's also really, really small kind of almost DIY, do-it-yourself things that you can do within your organization, right? You can have, I don't know, a fishbowl in the office, and you can have anyone write any question, concern, anything they're grappling with, right? It's totally anonymous. And then you just have this group, right, come together, maybe it's once a month, and you open each session with taking a couple of questions and having a conversation, right, about that particular topic, right? I mean, there's easy things you can do around, hey, let's rotate who's going to find an interesting article to bring in that we're going to talk about, right? You can kind of use that group one to kind of in practice with one another, kind of work through real life scenarios, but then you can use that same group to say, hey, we have an opportunity to actually present to the board and really articulate where our culture is today, where we aspire for the culture to be. Let's come up with a set of questions we want to ask the board, right? That we want to bring senior leadership together. There's all of these things that you can do to unlock kind of the interest and the investment of employees for really not any money. It's great, I think, to be able to bring in an outside person to kind of help you think through how to do that, but it doesn't have to be some big, huge, culture assessment, right? And someone that comes in and spends months and months and months. I think there's a lot that you can do yourself if people are willing to kind of roll up their sleeves and do the work with their employees.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
If there are no other questions, I think we're going to wrap it up. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. It's getting close to 9:30. Chanda, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Your thoughts and insight were just amazing, and I hope everybody here found it really helpful and inspiring for them and their organizations. I want to wish you and all the other moms here a happy Mother's Day this weekend. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate the thanks you guys are throwing in the chat right now. We at Mission Control, we try to do one of these kind of talks about every 6 weeks. We also have some other programming we mix in throughout the year. So stay tuned for some email messaging for us with with our next event that'll be coming up sometime soon. So thanks, everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for all the important work you all do. It's really
Yes.
needed and appreciated. So thank you.